Welcome everyone. My name is Mary Ma and I'm a member of the Kellogg Alumni Relations team. Thank you for joining us today in our series, This is Kellogg. This is the second event in the series, a faculty panel, and our current series focuses on entrepreneurship. Today's presentation will last 1 hour. We encourage you to submit questions for our panel at any time via the Q&A icon that's at the bottom of your screen. We will address audience questions towards the end of the program. With that, I'm very happy to turn it over to Senior Associate Dean Jan Eberly to start our program. Thank you.
Oh, Jan, you're muted.
Thank you. I want to thank Mary for bringing us all together, and it's great to have such a large group join us for lunch today. We haven't been in large groups for lunchtime in quite a while, and it's great to have this conversation, which is the second installment in our virtual series, This is Kellogg, where we're continuing our focus on entrepreneurship. In today's event, we're going to hear from 3 faculty members and thought leaders at Kellogg as they share their insights and their research on entrepreneurship. This area is one of the most dynamic and exciting areas in Kellogg and in the workplace. Kellogg fosters founders and those who may be founders, think like founders, and aspire to create and innovate. We have an ecosystem of courses and activities that support this mindset, the career-long needs of innovators and entrepreneurs. As you'll be reminded today, especially hearing from our faculty, they bring both intellectual and executional expertise, both in how to think about entrepreneurship and how to do it. So today we have 3 leaders in the field. I want to start with David Schoenthal, a clinical professor of innovation and entrepreneurship and the faculty director of the Zell Fellows program. David?
Thank you, Dean Eberly. Let me pull up my slides. Hang on. And then the most commonly used phrase on Zoom other than "you're muted." Can you see my slides? Thumbs up. Yes? Great. Well, hi, I'm David Schonthal. As Jan mentioned, I'm a clinical professor of innovation and entrepreneurship here at the Kellogg School. Outside of Kellogg, I am a venture capitalist in the healthcare space with 7 Wire Venture Capital, as well as work at IDEO as a senior director in the venture design practice. So I bring a lot of clinical and applied experience to the world of entrepreneurship and the work that we do here. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is a project that I've been working on with another Kellogg colleague over the last year named Lauren Nordgren. Lauren is a professor in the Moores department and a behavioral psychologist. And together, Lauren and I have been studying what is it that prevents a good idea from actually getting hold in the market. So coming up with a good idea is something that's very important. Coming up with a new venture, the compelling new venture is really important. But having a good idea is only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is getting the market to actually adopt the idea once it's created. And so Lauren and I have been working on a theory called friction theory over the last year. And what you see in front of you is the cover of a book that we're going to be coming out with in October called The Human Element, which really brings some of this research to life. And a metaphor to think about how this theory works is anytime something takes flight. So for example, when a bullet is fired from a gun, it leaves the barrel of a gun traveling at 1,300 feet per second, breaking the sound barrier. If shot at the ideal angle, a bullet can travel nearly 2 miles and with precision hit its target in the hands of a capable user. And we often start this presentation talking about friction theory by asking the audience, well, what is it that makes a bullet fly? What is it that makes a bullet fly and that it can achieve this 2-mile distance and the precision that it achieves as part of its flight? Most people's instinct is the thing that makes a bullet fly is gunpowder. And when gunpowder ignites, it creates an enormous pressure inside the barrel of a gun. And the only way for that gas to escape the barrel is to push the bullet through the end of the barrel, propelling it towards its target. So gunpowder is not the wrong answer, but gunpowder is only one part of the answer. It's woefully incomplete. The other factor that comes into play is all of the forces that opposes that bullet once it leaves the barrel of the gun. It's the force of gravity, it's the force of resistance and drag on that bullet. And unless the bullet is able to overcome those forces working against it, it will never actually meet its target at the end. And this is very much a metaphor for what it is that allows innovation to take flight. What makes an idea actually take flight and get to its target? In the course of in the context of a bullet, it's not just the power that forces a bullet towards its target, it's the aerodynamics of the projectile itself. It's the rotations that it has, it's the narrow aerodynamic shape. And if you think about this as the metaphor, there are two forces working when it comes to change. Number one is the fuel an idea has. And we define fuel in our work as all of the traditional marketing and innovation things that you would think about, whether it's price, product, promotion, all of the features and benefits that make an idea desirable. Working against the fuel of that idea is something we refer to as friction, all of the forces that oppose that change. And as innovators and as entrepreneurs, we're classically trained to think in fuel. In fact, Kellogg for a long time was kind of a fuel school. We were known for marketing. We were known for how to make ideas more compelling, how to make products more interesting and ventures more disruptive. But we often did it in the absence of thinking about what it was that awaited those ideas once they got into the market. We think in fuel because it's our default mindset as human beings. And the reason we think in fuel, and it is our default mindset, is because we see behavior as a result of internal forces and minimize the situational causes. One of the things that Lauren Nordgren likes to say is when you see a driver on the expressway or the freeway driving 80 miles an hour and swerving in and out of traffic, our first instinct is that that person is a jerk. That person is nasty. They're a terrible driver. And it never really occurs to us, maybe they've got an emergency. Maybe they really have to use the bathroom. And there are some other explanations for their behavior. We tend to think that we are in control of the environment around us versus thinking about these external and situational causes. So in friction theory, we look at what we are calling the four forces of friction, or the four major frictions that work against change. And we're going to describe them for you now, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. So instead of just thinking about fuel moving an idea towards the market, what are the forces that stand in its way? The first is the one that answers this question. Does the idea, does the venture, does the product, does the service represent a major break from the status quo? Does it ask people to do something different than they have done in the past? And if the answer to this is yes, the force that we think is at play is something that we're referring to as inertia. All of the habit that people have developed over the years, over the time in their lives, working in the field that they work in, all of a sudden, because your new product or service shows up in the market, doesn't mean that people are going to change 20, 30, 40 years of the way they've lived in order to adopt that new idea. And so friction is something that is standing in your way. How might you overcome, inertia is something that's standing in the way. How might you overcome that inertia by making your idea more aerodynamic? What is the costliness of implementation of the idea? And this can be costliness in terms of economic cost, but it can also be costliness in terms of the amount of effort you have to expend in order to adopt that new idea. And the friction that corresponds to this type of effort, expenditure, and costliness is the friction of effort. How much work are you expecting somebody to do in order to adopt this idea? And it can be physical effort, it can be economic effort, it can also just be the ambiguity of how to adopt that idea. If it's not clear how it fits into somebody's work or in their life, there's a fair amount of cognitive load that we're placing on them, which increases the amount of effort that stands in the way of whatever that new venture or product might be. This is an interesting one because it often doesn't come up in market research. This is something where the symptoms of this friction tend to present themselves differently than the underlying cause. And the friction question here is, what negative feelings might your new idea produce in others? Just because it's a great idea doesn't mean that somebody won't feel threatened by it, anxious by it, nervous about it, afraid of it. And this is the friction of emotion. What are the undesired feelings we might provoke in others by bringing this new thing to market, and how might we address those when we're planning the launch of a venture, product, or service. And then finally, does the audience feel pressured to change? Nobody likes being sold to, nobody likes being changed by others. How does our resistance to being changed actually make us think differently about something new when it comes to market? This is the friction of reactance, the impetus or the impulse to resist being changed by others. And so in this book and in this research, we focus on these 4 frictions, and the way that we lay this out is in 2 parts. For every friction, we want to talk about how you spot this friction in the wild. How does it present itself? How are the symptoms different than the underlying issues? And then we talk about remedies to address each of these frictions. And the ideal scenario is that innovators, entrepreneurs, and other types of change makers will be able to forecast the frictions that are likely going to be creating headwinds for their ideas so that they can make their ideas more aerodynamic and ensure that those products and services get to market. And the big idea, if you take nothing else away, is really this, that often removing friction is more powerful than increasing fuel. If we think about the force of fuel and the force of friction working against each other, most innovators' instincts is in order to create an ability for the idea to get from here to there, I need to increase its magnetism. I need to add a feature or add a benefit or change the price or make the thing itself more compelling, when in fact, what we would argue is removing the friction that stands in that idea's way can often be more economical and more powerful than simply enhancing features and benefits to try to get it to improve. So that is a quick 8-minute and 30-second overview of friction theory. And I will also just say before I turn it over, I think that this, and obviously I'm biased, I also think the really cool thing about what we're doing with this is it's a great collaboration between research faculty and applied faculty at Kellogg. Lauren's deep experience in research and in experimental psychology and behavioral psychology really brings this book to life by explaining the science of why these things work. And the applied examples we bring show how it actually works in action. And I think that what you'll continue to see as Kellogg continues to grow its entrepreneurship discipline is more of these interactions between research faculty and applied faculty, bringing new ideas to life by the combinatorial benefit of both. So speaking of research faculty, one of our most talented research faculty is next, Professor Dashun Wang.
First, unmute myself, check. Second, share screen. All right. All right, you guys see it okay? All right, hi everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Dashun Wang. I'm currently a professor at Morse, and I'm the director of the Center for Science of Science and Innovation at Kellogg, which is the first center worldwide dedicated to the research of this emerging field many of us call science of science and innovation. Today, I want to talk about a mathematical paper we recently published regarding entrepreneurship, where we discovered this idea of a tipping point between failure and success. And I thought today what I'm going to do is to give you a little bit of taste of what that mathematical framework is, but then sort of give you some examples of how do we think about these insights in your own practice. So let me start with someone who deeply understands the concept of success and listen what he has to say about success.
I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed.
So I'm a big fan of Michael, and in this case, he actually gave me a research question to study. The idea here is to think about, success is often preceded by repeated attempts that initially fail. But how exactly do we fail over and over to eventually succeed? And the reality is that only some histories of failure lead to success. So that begs the question of which kinds of failure patterns ultimately yield results. Conventional explanations on this center around luck or differences between winners and losers based on their different learning strategies or individual characteristics. Our new research published in Nature shows us the answer actually is not that simple. In this research, we look at 3 kinds of data sets that are from apparently 3 very different domains to look at how different individuals and organizations fail over and over and eventually achieve success or not. In the first example, we look at the NIH setting, which is the largest funder for biomedical research in the world, where we look at the PIs of NIH and they try to apply for grants, and then they fail over and over. Eventually, they get the grants or not. Second setting, we look at all entrepreneurship investments by VCs over the past 45 years, where we look at the founders, and in this case, serial entrepreneurs, where founders try to launch a startup and didn't quite work out, try again and didn't quite work out, or may eventually lead to their success. And the third, very outside the box type of domain we look at are terrorist organizations, where terrorist organizations come together and launch an attack and didn't really yield any results, and keep doing that until they claim casualties in the end. Okay, so across all these 3 domains, we want to sort of study this data, but we want to build a common mathematical framework for us to think about this process of how do we sort of build on the past experience and launch another attempt, and then sort of learn from the past. And the simplest way to think about this is to think about, how do we learn from the past is to view failure as a wonderful thing that actually offers 2 crucial assets. One is experience, the other one is feedback. So you can think about each attempt includes multiple different kinds of components that you need to satisfy. Think about a business startup requires a viable idea, a revenue model, operational practices, leadership team, and others. And failure in this domain, for example, a delayed IPO, would actually shed lights on whether or not to reuse certain component in the past, or like sticking to the old team or the old revenue model, or think about the feedback from the past failures to think about what are the components you want to update. So then sort of a simple way to think about this is, given your past failure, you want to think about, should I try some new approach this time, or should I just stick to the old components? Now, this is a very simple and generalizable framework, but what's interesting is what comes out of this framework. If we assume this is a simple process, then what we'll realize is that how much we'll benefit from the past failure actually does not follow a smooth path, but a very abrupt one characterized by the concept of tipping points that separates stagnation and successful regions. And this is very much similar to the physical transition of water and ice that many of us are familiar with. In the stagnation region, people learn little from past failures, and such as entrepreneurs learning only from the most recent startups while ignoring all other failures. Those in this region hit an early and terminal saturation point, failing to engage in the intelligent improvement. In many cases, they threw out many prior attempts altogether, though some of these components may actually have been our target. The stagnation region then is similar to water's physical phase of ice. Think about if you increase the temperature from -40 degrees Celsius to -10 degrees, meaning you're learning more from the past, but it's not enough that ice remains solid. But learning just from a feel more of past experience may lead one go past this tipping point. Think about a 0 degree Celsius transition from ice to water, and now you're entering all of a sudden a region of progression and success. In this case, entrepreneurs may use feedback to engage in the intelligent improvement, yielding incrementally better attempts and ultimately approach to victory. So those who eventually achieve success fail much faster and increasingly fast with every attempt, reusing previous components effectively rather than discarding the baby with the bathwater as their stagnant peers do. And very importantly, the now popular concept of tipping point suggests that small changes could make a very big difference. So in these models, the difference between those who succeed and fail may be virtually indistinguishable regarding how they learn from the past and or their productivity. Think about water at -1 degree versus +1 degree. The temperature difference is negligible, but the reality between the two is fundamentally different. So this also suggests that of two equally promising and lucky entrepreneurs, one may enjoy a wildly successful IPO while the other doesn't. So when we think about this, then sort of the concept then means is that even in the absence of distinguishing characteristics, individuals and organizations may experience fundamentally different outcomes. And what we find is that despite the simplicity of the model and the diversity of the domain we study, we find people across fields, terrorists, entrepreneurs, or scientists, predictably diverge into success and stagnation groups. And very importantly, these two groups are of a similar size and initial characteristics, but they are actually very much distinguishable already at a very early stage before the eventual outcome becomes apparent. So this brings us to this famous quote by the master of failure, Thomas Addison, to think about many of life's failures are people who didn't realize how close they were to success when they give up. And in this case, our study sort of illustrates now we actually have a new mathematical framework to tell us where we are in this journey of failures. Now, in the last 2 minutes, 3 minutes, I want to share sort of how do we conceptualize this into our own practice. And I learned this from a friend of mine, Rodney Mullen. Rodney is not an academic. He's actually a skateboarder. For a long time, I introduced him as a Michael Jordan of skateboarding. And then it turns out I was wrong. It turns out he's both the Michael Jordan and Leonardo da Vinci of skateboarding. He defended world championships 35 out of 36 times in 11 years. These are on the Wikipedia, the different tricks he invented doing skateboarding. So many of you may not be familiar with the sport. Let's sort of give you a quick clip on what we're talking about here. So that's where Rodney got my attention by raising this question of how do you practice something that could get you killed? So that's where I realized the skateboarding is very much similar as starting a startup, because there's two aspects. The first, you're trying a new trick. It has never done before. You don't even know it will work. How do you get there? Because nobody has done it before. And second, failure in this case is of consequence. If you don't do it well, you get yourself killed. So then sort of how do we do this? Then I think I can learn a great deal on how people actually practice a new trick. So let me give you another clip on how this kind of works.
I knew it was wearing on them, 7 hours back and forth.
So this is so frustrating, I'm sure. It just repeats, fail, and over. And it doesn't seem like how we can take away with. But now I want to remind you to conceptualize that clip through the mathematical model I just described. As you're trying to move closer to something that you want to achieve, I want to think about what are the different components on this task. How are you optimizing, taking into account the past experience, and focus on which to improve. So with this, remind you of the framework, let's watch what this fellow does next and think about the different updates and really different steps.
Damn it, I want it so bad, man.
here's the last slide with a lot of text so you can take away with. What can we take away with this? First is to think about how do we learn from the past? And here the important part we learned through our different research projects is that we need to recognize the importance of making incremental improvements. And the idea here is to try to get to the bleeding edge of what's possible, but not too much more. And this point of not too much more is very important for two reasons. First, it allows you to capitalize on past experience, not overreact to your past failures. Second, survival always comes first. This allows you to not hurt yourself so you can try again, actually get up. And the second point is to think about this idea of fail faster and faster. And this is both a strategy and a diagnosis. So in terms of strategy, this is the idea of a rapid prototyping and see what works, adapt, eyes on the prize, stay focused on what needs to be improved. And the second is also a diagnosis. The fail fast mantra popular in Silicon Valley should be seen as prescriptive, but also diagnostic. If you're not failing faster over time, it may mean that you're stuck in the stagnation region, making the wrong improvements while appearing busy and productive. So the key here is then re-examining if efforts are targeted at the wrong areas and missing the critical transition to a success region. And thank you all very much. That's what I want to share first today. And feel free to check out our websites for more information on these projects. And now I'm going to pass to Ben.
Ben, I assume you have a bunch of skateboarding videos in your deck also.
I was going to say that Dashun really stole my concept for my talk. I'm very disappointed with that. So actually, I'm going to change directions. First of all, it's just great to be with you all and have a chance to talk about some of the work we've been doing collectively at Kellogg. I'm going to change directions in the sense that I'm not going to talk about sort of methodologies of being successful in entrepreneurship, but I'm going to step back and think a little bit about what makes for an entrepreneurial ecosystem, a country, a nation, in particular the United States, what makes the US entrepreneurial. And I want to do it by talking more narrowly about one piece, which is the role of immigration, of immigrants, kind of the people part of the innovation ecosystem. And, when you think about immigration, in its role in the economy, you're going to hear a very common narrative kind of all the time, which is sort of looks dimly upon the role of immigrants in the economy. And it's this idea that immigrants come to your country and they take jobs from those who are already there. In economic terms, immigrants expand the labor supply in the country or region. They then compete for jobs with the people who are already there, the native-born workers. And you might think that makes it harder on the native-born workers, people who are already there, either to find jobs or in economic terms to end up with lower wages because they're now having to compete for the jobs they want with these immigrant entrants into their community. And of course, this narrative is both very common. I know everyone hears this, the taking jobs narrative, and it seems very powerful actually in policy as well, right? We have very controversial policy debates around immigration policy in this country, in the United States, but of course, in so many other countries around the world. And for those who are seeking to limit immigration, this is kind of one of the key arguments they'll make, that it's actually going to be bad for the workers who are already here. Now, there is a different narrative, and for those who come from more innovation ecosystems, one often thinks about immigrants and playing a key role in kind of inventing and in science and in entrepreneurship. And this is a completely different perspective. It's actually going to say that it's not that immigrants take jobs, they may just create jobs, right? And how do they do that? Well, they can do that a variety of ways, but one particular way that I want to talk about is they might start new businesses as employers, create vacancies, and then go and employ people who are already there. They increase the demand for workers, and that could actually improve the labor market prospects for people who are already there, working in these new companies, and they may find higher wages, for example, as a result. So this is exactly the opposite narrative in terms of immigrants and their effect on the workforce and productivity and opportunity in the economy. Okay, so I've done some recent work that's trying to get at which effect is stronger. I mean, obviously, to some extent, immigrants do take jobs, and when they start companies, they do create jobs. So sort of what's happening on net? Which force is stronger? And so to try to answer this, I've been able to get together with some colleagues, research colleagues, and in particular, some really rather amazing data resources held by the United States Census Bureau. And in particular, you can get from the Census Bureau data about every single business in the United States, and every worker in those businesses, as well as demographic information about those workers, including whether the workers are born in the US or what country they're coming from, where they were born. And you can also look at that for the founders of the firms, okay? So we were able to get data from the US Census, really quite remarkable data. It's held with great privacy restrictions, obviously, where we could study every single new business that was created in the United States, millions of new businesses between 2005 and 2010, and then look at sort of how they're performing years later. We could also get a representative sample of all the businesses in the United States today. And we also separately did our own exercise where we hand curated the current Fortune 500 companies, traced them back to their roots, and found out who the founders were. Were they born in the US or were the founders born abroad? Okay, so I'm just going to focus on one piece of the data. And the reason I'm going to do that is because they all tell exactly the same story, which I'll show you in a second. But the first thing that you see in this data is that immigrants are actually exceptionally entrepreneurial compared to the native born. So immigrants, the immigrants start businesses at a rate 80% higher than the native born. So if you think of so we'll take the baseline probability that someone born in the United States will start a business in a given year, and take all the immigrants, they're 80% more likely to start a business. Okay, so it's a really huge increase in entrepreneurial orientation. Now, when you come back to this motivating question about sort of creating jobs versus taking jobs, however, you can't just look at the rate at which immigrants start businesses. You'd have to look at what happens to those businesses, right? So if almost all of these businesses were very small and employed sort of one person, they wouldn't have a huge effect in creating demand for the workforce. But if we're talking about, Google or Amazon or very large businesses, then they could employ large numbers of people. So what you really want to know is not just how often people start businesses, but what happens to those businesses, what's the employment that results. And what you find is not only that immigrants start businesses at a much higher rate, but they actually start businesses of all sizes at a higher rate. I'll draw a picture that looks like this. This is a downward sloping line. It's something that economists have marveled at for a long time. It's called Zipf's law, so-called power law. And what we have on the vertical axis is how many businesses there are of a given type. And then on the x-axis going across here is how big the business is. And when you do sort of the logarithm of each, you get this amazing straight line. So somehow in all of the entrepreneurial and business growth and bankruptcies and everything we do in this society, somehow we arrange as businesses arrange themselves in this perfect straight line. Another interesting version of this is the size of cities and towns in the United States. If I made this the number of towns of a certain size or cities, and this is the size of the city, you get this exactly sort of similar straight line relationship. So somehow, we're all making free choices, but somehow we arrange ourselves in these incredibly regular ways according to sort of statistical laws, Zipf's law. Okay, so what is this showing? This is showing the blue line, which is businesses founded by immigrants, and the gray line is businesses founded by native-born Americans. And what you're seeing is that every firm size, from small to large, as you go across here, you see the immigrants have the proportion of immigrants who started a business of that size is much higher than the proportion of native-born workers who started a business of that size. So, simply put, because immigrants are more entrepreneurial relative to their population, and because they start bigger businesses of all size, more businesses of all size, in the end, immigrants actually employ more people in their businesses than they take jobs in the workforce. They're creating more jobs than their own quantity in the workforce, okay? And so on net, immigrants create more jobs than they take. So when you look at this, you actually see that the narrative really should go the other way. We should think of immigrants as key to the entrepreneurial system, driving better opportunities for workers in the United States, which is quite the reverse of how it is normally talked about, at least in many policy discussions. A related feature is that immigrants are also, their firms are technically more technology oriented. So it's more tech entrepreneurship. So here what I've done is I've divided all the businesses up into size, so kind of small to large. And then the vertical axis here is the probability that that business has a patent. So it has some patentable invention, which we can think of as one measure of how sort of technology oriented the business is. And you can see that at every size bucket, the blue bar, that's the immigrant founded firms, is higher than the gray bar, meaning that immigrant firms in that size bucket are more likely to have a patent. And that's just generally true. In fact, we know in separate evidence, that's research not done by me, but a bunch of other colleagues in the field, that immigrants are also far more inventive. They're more likely to have patents as inventors. They're actually more likely to write high impact, high market value patents than native-born individuals. So when you actually take these kind of innovation entrepreneurship lens on immigration, you come to a very, very different point than if you took sort of the classic sort of they compete for jobs view. And this suggests that one way to improve the American economy and its innovativeness and its entrepreneurial success and create more and better jobs would actually be to bring in more immigrants, not less. So let me just stop there and say thank you, and I'm happy to, of course, take questions on this type of topic. I'm turning over to Dan. Okay, yeah.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to all three of our speakers. I want to open it up for discussion here, and while you're thinking about questions, I want to kick it back to the group, starting with David. This has been, quite a life-changing and tumultuous past 15 months, and in many ways, you might think there'd be a lot of, inertia, a lot of obstacles in people's way. But at the same time, innovation has really been front and center in everything from the vaccines, which are, high priority, to small innovations and resilience from individual firms finding ways to survive, as Dashun emphasized, given the many challenges that they've been facing. So what has struck you most about innovation and entrepreneurship during the pandemic? And we can get feedback from Ben and Dashun as well.
Yeah. So everything you said is on point. I think that, and I like that you quoted inertia. I mean, one of the biggest things that stands in the way of anybody doing something different than what they otherwise would is the habit of the present. And what I would say, despite all of the obvious tragedy that came from the COVID pandemic, one thing that was working with innovators is that people were willing to break old habits for the first time in maybe their entire lives. All of a sudden, things that were hard-coded in the way that we lived and worked were up for grabs. So had you said, hey, we're going to do an alumni event for a couple hundred people, should we do it in person or should we do it over Zoom? 18 months ago, I think a lot of people would have said we should do it in person. There's nothing like in person. Zoom is like, let's not even consider it. All of a sudden, doing an alumni event with 180 people over Zoom was better than not doing an alumni event at all. So what we found in the world of venture and what we found in the world of innovation is that for the very first time in a long time, people are willing to go back and try new things and adjust the way they live and work because of the constraints that COVID placed on us. So if you're in medicine or you're in services or e-commerce, there were many, many businesses that got huge tailwinds of momentum that probably, were it not for COVID, would have languished for another couple of years before people warmed up to the value propositions that they were proposing. So in many ways, at least for tech firms, this was a pretty big accelerant.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that with work from home. I've been doing some research there where most of the technology, the fact that we could pivot so quickly tells us that all the technology was there, right? But nobody wants to be the one person on Zoom when everybody's in person, right? So the pandemic forced us to overcome this coordination problem. And now we're thinking about working from home as sort of part of the toolkit for workplace management. Dashun, did you want to jump in on this question of innovation during the pandemic? What struck you about this unique and tumultuous period?
Yeah, so I actually have two thoughts. One is related to a paper Ben and I just submitted this week. So I'll leave that to Ben if he wanted to describe more. The other one is a paper that we're going to actually also very much new research from us that were actually close to submission as well, where I thought I learned a great deal and I want to share with this audience and just get us thinking about this. So the new data we have is not on entrepreneurship, but it's related to innovation, particularly in science, where when we sample all the principal investigators in science in the US and Europe during the pandemic and see how they did in 2020, what do we find is this phenomena that sort of intrigued me is a sort of a loss of new ideas, what do we see from our data? It seems like people on average started much fewer new projects during the pandemic. And it's kind of interesting in two ways in terms of what we discovered here. One is that if you look at all the scientists across domains, they have obviously very different nature of work. You know, some require lab, they don't have access, some just need some computers. But no matter which field you're from, what we find is that you're basically affected by a very similar rate. So it's very homogeneous across fields. But second is also sharply split across personal dimensions, where we find if you're female or with childcare responsibilities, then you're really severely affected by this. So that sort of points to this idea that it's actually more personal dimensions are sort of affecting this idea of sort of fewer new ideas. So this is sort of raising an alarm for me, because then this sort of likely mean amid all the different forces that may prevent us from innovating, you know, these the phenomena we discovered may not be limited to science or scientists, but may sort of apply to innovative careers more broadly. So that's something I want to share here, because it sort of influenced my own practice, is to be sort of cognizant that, you know, COVID basically halted in-person or spontaneous interactions with others, which has historically facilitated with new ideas and new collaborations. And what we see initial evidence is that there seems to be a global decline that's in a substantial rate on the starting of new ideas. And then my second thought was related to pivots. So I don't know if Ben want to continue, but, you know, I'll pass it over to Ben to add more, but if not, we'll circle back.
Jump in, Ben, and then I have some immigration questions for you.
Sure. Okay. Well, briefly, I mean, I think, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and we haven't seen any kind of crisis like this at a global scale in so long. Sort of not surprisingly, everybody had to adapt from your own personal way of working to the restaurant, to the airlines, to the et cetera. But you know, most of those innovations were about the symptoms of the pandemic. And really, in the end, a very narrow set of innovations, namely vaccines, are actually the solutions to the pandemic. And I think one thing I've taken from this is just, you know, how important science is. And just to, you know, so I don't leave you hanging with the thing Dashun was alluding to. We've done some work on sort of looking at how scientists responded to the pandemic, and they responded massively. But what's really interesting is that unless you happen to be really closely related to the key topics, your work wasn't very good. People wanted to help, but you really needed to be expert. And if you think about it, amidst all this innovation, it's the people who actually knew something about mRNA vaccines, for example, or coronaviruses and spike proteins and these kinds of things. Those are really just very narrow forms of expertise, but very, very essential. And I think one lesson we've taken from that is, you know, your ability to solve kind of emergent threats, whether it's a pandemic or maybe climate change or something else, you know, really depend on having the right people in place. And that it requires a pretty big scale of the science enterprise to have kind of the right kind of expertise, because not all scientists can actually help.
Yeah, I want to come back to the point on science, Ben, but we've gotten a number of questions following up on your presentation on immigration, and basically asking, you know, you've documented this outsized effect of immigrants on entrepreneurship, and whether you have a sense of why that's happening. Is it unique to the US? Is there something special about the ecosystem or the environment in the US that's especially welcoming for immigrant entrepreneurs? Or, you know, more generally, what are the whys behind this apparently robust fact that you've documented?
Right. So the fact is robust. I think the whys are maybe many, and I think that's the kind of the frontier of research now in this. I can tell you a couple of things and how I'm sort of thinking about it, but with the caveat that I think more work is needed to really be very confident about the answer to this question. We do see that immigrants are risk tolerant, right? And to go back to kind of what, you know, David or Dashun were saying at the very beginning, I mean, whether the kind of the psychology of being able to overcome friction or the willingness to do that, or to get on that skateboard and go down those steps. When you cross a border, you know, when you decide to move to another country, you are of course demonstrating a sort of adventurism, a tolerance for risk that might be more than the typical person has. And of course, that kind of very risk tolerance and willingness to seek something better is kind of an innovation of itself to go to a new country in your life. And I think that might just be selecting on people who are entrepreneurial. And that may be the main general reason. Because it's also true, I can tell you this, that it doesn't really matter where you come from in the US. So we divided the sample of all immigrants, because we know where you're born, into those who come from so-called OECD countries, which means sort of very high income countries like the US, that'd be like coming from Sweden to the US, or non-OECD countries, which would be coming from less lower income countries, which you think would have sort of lower health status or less education on average. But what do you see? You see that shift is identical for both immigrants from the OECD and immigrants from lower income countries into the US, which just suggests that there's maybe actually something more psychological, something taste oriented. So again, I can't tell you for sure, but I would put my bets, as from what I know, on this kind of willingness for risk and adventurous spirit.
Yeah, one of the questions I was going to ask, I think, goes to the point you just made, and I was going to emphasize it in coming from our audience. It was asking whether there's a statistical bias in who the immigrant entrepreneurs are. So essentially, does the 80% number take into account selection, which is, I think, what you were just saying. So I can tell our students learned their data lessons well.
Very good.
Excellent. There was also a question, just a short follow-up on that. Were you entirely looking at legal immigration? Is there any story to be told about illegal immigration here?
Well, that's an interesting question. So we actually look kind of extensively at that, because if you think, well, what are we saying? We're sort of taking a pool of all the immigrants in the United States that are legal or documented, basically, and asking the share of those people who start businesses. And that's that 80% number. You might think maybe we're kind of understating that pool of immigrants, because maybe there's a bunch of illegal immigrants. And so actually the rate among all immigrants would be sort of lower. But the thing is, you would have to scale up the number of immigrants by basically 80% to kind of kill that fact. And if you look at kind of the debates on the amount of, so first of all, our measures actually do include the standard estimates of the undocumented immigrant population. And the range of debate there is, up or down 2-3 million people, like of people who say it's this many, others say, no, it's 3 million more. It's like 10 to 13 million, actually. You would actually need like 35 or 40 million undocumented immigrants to kind of change the facts of our paper. So it's just, there's no evidence that there's anything anywhere close to that in terms of the ability to change sort of the sentiment of what I was telling you.
Okay, cool. There's a question for Dashun now about venture firms, and this person has a research idea for you, saying that venture firms get hundreds/thousands of business plans per year. Have you considered studying why some succeed and some fail? It seems like that's pretty close to what you're describing in your paper.
This is absolutely a great idea, and it's something that we are hoping to study, and is actually something that actually is more difficult to collect systematic data. I think it's a fair question to me, but also a fair question to every VC firm, is to say, you guys have just repeat the same question to them that I've done repeatedly, is, you guys have hundreds and thousands of business plans, sometimes monthly basis. Have you studied the ones you rejected, or which one is successful? I think it's the same type of question, and then the universal answer is always no. I have yet to find someone that actually studied their own portfolio and trace what happens. And although every one of them also in the habit of celebrating the success that they actually found it. So this is sort of the frontier of the research. I think unfortunately here the limitation is the data. Is how do we capture systematic data on all the business plans that presented to VCs and different levels of presentation. So we don't have systematic study on that yet. And so hopefully that will change and we'll have some data, but this absolutely is on point question. Thank you.
I want to go back to Ben's remark about the importance of science, and several of us mentioned vaccines. It struck me that Moderna says that essentially they had a prototype for a vaccine back in March because they had the mRNA technology ready to go, and all they needed was a sequenced virus to execute. So I think this is interesting in many ways because it both emphasizes the incredible importance of basic research. So having the underlying technologies there, but then this huge focus on execution, right? Which David has talked about and Dashun has talked about as well, that that we have this idea that innovation comes from the stroke of genius. But so much of actually, taking a business to fruition and taking an idea to have an impact on the world is about the execution. So are there new lessons from that we should be thinking about from the pandemic? I mean, what I took away from Dashun was, fail a lot as a way of experimenting and learning. Are there additions to that or nuances that we've picked up over the last year, given just the scale of the innovation that we needed to move forward? This is for anybody. David?
Well, I mean, I love that the quote that Dashun put in his slide deck around coming so close to success and giving up because of failure. One thing I will say, because this is a Kellogg alumni audience, is we can teach students methods for innovation. We can teach students how to build a venture. We can teach them the operations and the mechanics. It's really hard to manufacture or teach somebody grit and perseverance. And I think that skateboarding video was like the perfect example of perseverance in action, getting bruised and bloodied and battered over and over and over again. There were so many opportunities for this one individual to give up on learning this trick, but felt internally compelled to figure out how to master it. And I think the one thing that we're studying in entrepreneurship at Kellogg, and you're continuing to try to understand better, is what does entrepreneurial DNA look like for different entrepreneurial career paths? And I will say that it's important to mention, and this is not directly an answer to your question, Jan, but I do think that there's this misconception that entrepreneurship is tech entrepreneurship, and that entrepreneurship is always coming up with an invention and commercializing it, or commercializing a vaccine or a biotechnology. Entrepreneurship can be buying a franchise. Entrepreneurship can be investing in real estate. Entrepreneurship can be buying a small business and growing it. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do at Kellogg and have made huge strides in doing over the last 8 years is giving students a variety of different paths into entrepreneurship that match their phenotype and that makes them feel comfortable with the entrepreneurial path, so that it's not, I'm making an all or nothing bet on a molecule. It's, I'm passionate about growing something and making a difference in the world. And there's a couple of different paths I can take that match my risk profile.
I just want to jump in as well, because I think Jan, your question is exactly right. I mean, execution, and we think, oh, entrepreneurship or innovation in general, it's just about creativity, right? But actually that's important, but the execution is at least as important, because the first idea is not your last idea, and it's incremental, and all of these ideas we've talked about today. And I've had student entrepreneurs at Kellogg come to me with ideas for their business, and I listen to it. I think this is not a good idea. I mean, this is just, there's no margin, there's no intellectual property, there's no market structure, there's no power. How are you going to monetize this in a big way? And then they go and they do really well. And the reason is they're just out executing the other businesses. They're just better at it. I mean, I'm talking about, shoes or a restaurant, or, it's not high tech. It's just doing it better and winning an enormous amount of market share. And so I think, and I'm going to bend back to another Kellogg theme, which is collaboration. And I think, general management skills are so important to the success of the enterprise, of every enterprise, including the new venture. And you don't have to be the creative genius or the deep technological expert in some new nuance of technology. That can be part of your team, right? And so I think, for an MBA in particular, the essential role that you can play is that execution role, and building your team and using those sort of Kellogg collaboration skills and all the other skills of business to do just that. And I think that really is, I put that almost top of the list of success in entrepreneurship above everything else.
I can't believe we're here, but this is the last question. And just for lack of time, not for lack of content. So playing off what you've just been talking about, someone asked a question that just goes to this phenotype concept that David mentioned, reacting to Ben's point about the reactionary entrepreneur. So can you talk about the differences between what he called a reactionary entrepreneur, so someone who ramps up mask production during mass production during a pandemic, versus a predictive entrepreneur who's sort of forging ahead and meeting a need that people didn't know they had. On my screen, I'm looking at David and Ben. You probably can't see that, but or Dashun, who wants to pick that one up? Quick answer.
I sort of feel like Ben is Ben. I think Ben's got a strong point of view on this. I can see it in his eyes.
Well, I think, again, necessity is the mother of invention. So people are going to do so-called survival innovation. I think that's like what a restaurant has had to do. And you'd still be more or less successful at it because of, once again, your execution. But those who are perceiving new trends or new opportunities for a new product or service, business model, or new nonprofit, anything, I really believe it depends on depth of expertise in the market that you're looking at, that kind of deep market knowledge. In fact, in other data, using the same data I talked about with the immigration, I've done other studies looking at the demographics of entrepreneurship. And one of the things that we find that is very, very strong is that people who have worked in the very narrow sector where they're going to create their business have a far, far higher chance of a home run. I mean, it's 2-3 times the chance. This idea that you should come from outside of the industry with kind of transformative, outside the box thinking, maybe a little bit that's good, but what you see in the data, and I mean all of the data, like every new business in America, what really wins is close and deep industry expertise. And I think that's because you understand, you see something other people don't see, which is a market need, right? And then you have some kind of network and expertise to assemble the team or whatever to network and resources and to solve. And so I that's what I would say. I would say for those who are doing this less reactionary entrepreneurship and more kind of, I see the opportunity, I'm going for it, it's probably something in your industry, and you'll kind of know when you see it. And so that can happen anytime in your career.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, David and Dashun as well. And to all of our participants for their great questions. Wonderful to have everybody together today. We look forward to being in person, we hope soon. And so I'll thank you all for joining us in this discussion of entrepreneurship. We'll follow this event with a webinar in June that showcases a panel of Kellogg alumni discussing their own entrepreneurship journeys. So stay tuned for more details. Everybody be well in the meantime. Thank you.